Hi, I'm Nick Haig, and welcome to the World's Greatest Business Thinkers podcast. Today's guest is one of the most influential men in marketing, a globally acclaimed keynote speaker, a TED Talk superstar with over 6.5 million views and described as one of the most unlikely TikTok sensations of the day. Rory Sutherland is the Vice Chairman of Ogilvy and a charismatic promoter of psychology and behavioural science, being the founder of Ogilvy Change, a behavioural science practice within the agency. He's held prestigious positions over the years as the president of the IPA and chair of the judges for the direct jury at Cannes. He's also written 3 books, including the best-selling book Alchemy. In 2021, he founded MadMasters, which is a hybrid learning program that helps marketeers, entrepreneurs, and commercial leaders use behavioral science and creativity to solve business challenges. So much to talk about today. And as always, if you like what you hear today, then please do like, follow, and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen, as it really does make a difference to the work we're doing with this podcast. Welcome to the World's Greatest Business Thinkers podcast, Rory.
I don't know if I quite warrant inclusion in that list, but I'll do my best.
Well, you definitely do, and delighted to have you on the show. Well, starting off, I mean, you joined Ogilvy, or Ogilvy and Mather, as it was back in the day, as a graduate trainee planner in the late 80s. And
I was actually a graduate trainee. I was supposed to be an account executive, and I was pretty terrible at it. I very quickly then became a planner, and then about 6 months later, became a copywriter, which I think is what I'd wanted to do all along, to be absolutely honest.
Right. Okay. Well, because I read something about you being inspired by the advertising industry and by growing up in the 80s. And I too grew up in that decade and remember fondly the adverts like, I don't know, Levi's Nick Kamen laundrette advert or the Kiora advert. I bet he drinks Carling Black Label. I can still recall these adverts.
Oh, yes. I mean, there was one I saw at the cinema, the first ad BBH did for Levi's, which was all about, I think, someone effectively exchanging a briefcase of currency for a pair of Levi's behind the Iron Curtain. To, I think, the background track was The Great Gate of Kiev by someone like Mussorgsky. And it was, I can remember that I have no idea what the film was it preceded. I have no memory of the film it preceded, but I can remember that ad as a kind of epiphany when I saw it. But actually, my love affair goes back earlier than that, to the 70s, which was the golden age of the colour supplement, the Sunday Times colour supplement.
Yes.
And you've got to remember that colour magazines weren't as, by any means, as kind of, ubiquitous then as they might be now. But the ads, particularly those done by Collett Dickinson Pierce, some of them, I think, by Ogilvy, the sort of double page. My brother and I, my brother's 18 months older than me, we used to fight to get the Sunday Times colour supplement first, predominantly to read the ads, not the content. The content was very good generally, and of course the quality of photography back then was actually vastly superior to now, when pretty much everything seems to be stock photography, rather depressingly. But we fought basically to read the ads because they were funny, witty, intelligent. I think that was probably dominated by the Collett Dickinson Pierce of the 1970s. But I mean, that was something which was a major, it was a significant part of your cultural life. Yeah. Particularly if you lived somewhere a bit provincial like me and was therefore starved of other forms of stimulus. And so, it was probably CDP press ads which first awakened my love of advertising. But then, as you quite rightly say, there was this golden age of the kind of, I suppose, the mid to late 80s, early 90s. It never quite recovered after. It never quite got its mojo back after about 92 as an industry. But it had a period, I think, where it was universally acknowledged by large businesses that great advertising was the single greatest unfair competitive advantage you could enjoy. That, by the way, is still, broadly speaking, true, but the focus of business has shifted so much to kind of financialization and operational efficiency that the kind of chutzpah that used to be put into salesmanship it's not completely absent, but it's much, much rarer than it was. Just absolutely heroic acts of brand building.
Yeah. And how do you think adverts compare to today's adverts to those of that golden era?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, I think there are very, very good marketing ideas. And by the way, I think not all of that is bad, because one of the things that I always fight against is the idea that creativity in business should be confined to the comms function or the marcoms function. And I hope people reading my book grasp that. There's an opportunity to be creative right across the 5 Ps of marketing. Okay, you can be really creative with pricing. Amazon Prime is a genius billion-dollar idea, for example. You can be really creative with all aspects of business decision making.
Yeah.
And so, in some ways, when I go to Cannes now, I'm happy, because you see these extraordinary kind of multimedia ideas or cross-platform ideas, which in some cases, by the way, are slightly contrived. In other cases, are actually really effective. But the idea that creativity works on a broader canvas is one I generally welcome. But at the same time, the best of TV advertising is, for whatever reason, it's still there. It's still, the heart's still beating. But partly the fragmentation of media, partly the kind of over preoccupation with nerdery in the bottom of the funnel, and kind of transactional short-term advertising over long-term brand building.
Yeah.
It's taken quite a serious hit.
Yeah.
Every now and then, the Super Bowl, Christmas ads for British retailers, there's a kind of resurgence in specific situations. But the Christmas ad mentality for John Lewis was, for a time, all advertising felt a bit like that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. I can still remember, 2
I
orange.
mean, a bit of us, maybe we're old farts, right?
Well,
Films were much better in my day. Well, I'm sure people said that in the 1970s, which was a tremendous period for film.
Yeah.
60s, not so much, was it? The 50s, glorious. 40s and 50s, fantastic. 60s, bit of a hiatus. 1970s, mojo back.
Well, my 2 sons would definitely say that I'm old and past it.
Yeah, and so our music taste, etc. But and at the same time, if you can solve a marketing problem with an app or with a piece of choice architecture without giving millions and millions of pounds to media owners, well, that's exactly what you should be doing. Okay, and you could argue that the opportunities to solve problems in those ways. I mean, I now run a behavioural science practice, and one of the first things we do is effectively go, what's the smallest thing we could change that would make a really big difference?
Yeah.
And sometimes that's nothing to do with brand or marcoms. I mean, for one client, we massively increased the propensity of people to pre-book food at cinemas just by changing, a UX change to the, in other words, the choice order of the website changed. And, you can then achieve a change in behavior, which is greater than that you could achieve with comms.
Yeah.
So, there's a bit of me which says, okay, a lot of this is kind of healthy, greater biodiversity, and I hope, a greater and broader canvas for creative ideas. I mean, Dave Trott would actually be entirely, I think, in support of this. That the job of he said, there are people who call themselves creative who are merely stylists. And the point is, sometimes the way you reinvent something or you change the game isn't a brand comms problem. And because historically ad agencies, which made money on commission, made all their money from the brand comms budget, they were in danger, well, they still are, I think, in perpetual danger of, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Right, how do we define this problem in terms of brand and communications in order that we can solve it in terms of brand communications? And that is not a healthy solution neutral approach. You should say, look, I mean, this would be something I very reluctantly say, because as a good marketer, dropping the price is probably the last thing you should try. But maybe there are cases where, yeah, there probably are, where actually your honest advice to a client would be, to be absolutely honest, I'd make it a bit cheaper.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you just mentioned there, Rory, you know the behavioural science practice within Ogilvy Change, and it's around using behavioural economics. So I think again as a good starting point for the rest of our questions, could you give our listeners just a bit of an overview of what behavioural economics are
Well,
and helps us understand why people do what they do?
I started in Ogilvy in direct marketing, which I still love, and I still consider myself a direct marketer by temperament, if you like. I believe in testing, very, very heavily believe in testing, and I believe in experimentation. But one of the things we already knew in direct marketing before there was such a thing as behavioral economics was that the way in which humans responded to information, stimuli, and context was very poorly aligned with theoretical views of how people responded, why people did the things they do, and the sort of traditional two crutches on which business rests when it comes to understanding consumer behavior would be economic theory. If you reduce the price, more people will buy it. Okay, which is sometimes true. Okay, but it's not nearly as true as people think it is. And the other crutch is market research, which is if you ask people what they want, they will tell you. And if you ask people why they did something, they will give an accurate narrative that explains their decision making process post hoc. And so neither of those things is totally useless, by the way. And very inspired market research is actually a form of behavioral science. And economic theory is not always wrong, by the way. Okay, I'm just want to make that point. But we would argue that there's a fundamental need for what a Buddhist might call a third eye, which is another way of looking at consumer behavior and motivation through the lens of what they're trying to do, which they may not even be aware they're trying to do. Okay,
Yeah.
so effectively, it's the effect of unconscious processes, unconsciously perceived cues in the environment, heuristics, instincts, intuitions, and indeed urges, which consumers are deeply affected by without necessarily being conscious of that effect. Okay. And I mean, a very useful shorthand, which I always use as a kind of checklist, is there's a neuroscientist called David Rock, who's, I think, based in New York. He's a Kiwi, who has this thing called the SCARF model. And humans deeply care about status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness or reciprocation, and fairness, for example. And if you violate any of those, you've made a big business mistake, often without realizing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those would be the interesting thing about SCARF. I don't think it's an exhaustive list. I think there are other things humans deeply care about. But what's quite interesting is they all tend to be things that we feel more strongly than we think, if you like. In other words, if someone thinks, I mean, I've long campaigned with rail companies, okay, that if you buy an advance ticket and you miss your train, okay, they make you buy a full fare ticket. But they don't count the value of the ticket you didn't use against the full fare ticket. Now, I understand from a purely logical economic point of view, that makes sense. I think nearly all consumers perceive that as not only have you made me pay full fare, you've made me pay twice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And so I would argue that even though it may make perfect economic logic if you're designing a yield management program, I'd argue that it's actually very, very bad marketing because it leaves your customers feeling you've ripped them off, which is not a good feeling to inculcate in people generally. That would be an example of fairness. Status would be an interesting one. How people, it's not just what people think of brands; it's also what they think brands think of them. That's a very interesting reversal. And in service industries, of course, in experienced businesses, hospitality, and so forth, that kind of thing is well understood as being hugely important.
Yeah. Well, I think that's good background for where we'll go with the rest of the conversation, Rory. And well, you've set up a couple of new companies, and I often get messages from listeners who are would-be entrepreneurs about whether they should set up a new business, but also more this worry that they're how to get noticed in today's modern manic world with limited marketing budget. Do you have any tips on how to cut through the noise and really get noticed with your marketing in today's busy world when you might have limited marketing dollars?
I do think that, I mean, I'll be absolutely candid with you. I only got famous on social media by luck, not intention, in that someone started taking clips of me during lockdown and they produced, I think it started with the TikTokizing, sort of 30 seconds of podcast TED Talks. There's an awful lot of content of me floating around on YouTube, which you can find quite easily if you look. And the first I knew about it was when I started getting mobbed by school kids. And occasionally my children would go, "Dad, what the hell are you doing on TikTok?" And I go, "I have absolutely no idea." Okay. However, I think the need now in the internet age for a more personal face to businesses, people want to see the person, not just the corporate video.
Mm.
I think that is a fundamental trend. There's a very, very good post on Scott Galloway's blog called Prof G, not written by Scott actually, but written by his assistant, on the idea that personalities and people in some ways trump brands. In other words, Joe Rogan beats CNN in a funny kind of way. Because one of them is a kind of logo and a brand, and the other one's actually, a fully formed human being. And by the way, I don't think that's an absolute rule. I'd never cite that, but I think as a trend, that's worth acknowledging. I mean, I always find it interesting. I've always wondered about that, which is whether things like Trusted Trader are making a mistake by not including 60 seconds of video. Okay. One of the reasons, by the way, I love behavioral science is that the same insight can be valuable to a Nestle or a Procter and Gamble, but can also be valuable to someone running a cafe or running a window cleaning business. So, in other words, this isn't the laws of physics, okay? But behavioral science does rhyme. You get recurring patterns, and you go, okay, well, if that works in this particular setting, it's at the very least worth testing in this slightly different setting. And I'll occasionally go around cafes and say things like, you must leave your seats outside on the pavement, even if it's raining. The reason is that people can see them from 400 yards away, and they immediately know there's a cafe over there and it's open because the seats are out on the pavement. Okay, if the seats are folded away, people go, "Oh, the cafe's closed." Okay,
Yeah.
you've got to be very, very careful about how people, what behaviour. There's a wonderful phrase, I think, invented by the sort of father of proper psychology, William James, where he says, he uses the word connote. What something connotes,
Right.
what it conveys.
Yes.
And there are an awful lot of behaviours, by the way, which we can be completely unaware of what they convey to customers. And so, one of the things I'd say is if you're a cafe, people will tend to assume, particularly if you're a tea room, which have really weird opening hours, they tend to close at 3 and stop serving food at 1:30. People will take any clue to infer that you're actually closed or unavailable or you've stopped serving, unless you're really explicit about the opposite.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I'm really interested partly in this, and I think partly this is the reason it's popular on TikTok, is because it's not just applicable to the Nestle marketing department, which I hope it is, but it's also applicable to someone running a window cleaning business or someone, because, and I'm really, really sympathetic, by the way, to small businesses because, okay, the problem is, and my father ran a small business. Among them, he was a property developer, but he also ran pleasure boats, water buses, taking parties on the Brecon and Abergavenny Canal.
Right.
And that was part of his business. And every now and then we do an ad and put it in the local paper. And the ad really worked very well. And I always look back and go, why didn't we do more advertising? Because every time we advertised, it worked. It made us money. There was no, there was absolutely no, I saw your ad in the paper. I'm quite interested in booking this thing. And it suddenly occurred to me that if you're running a small business, okay, marketing is the thing you can always postpone till tomorrow, right? So running a small business, you always have some present crises. You always have the current job to be done. You always have all that stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you have the marketing task. And the marketing task is valuable and it's important and it deserves quite a lot of thought. But it can always be done tomorrow. And that was, by the way, that would be exactly me. If I ran my own small business, even having spent 35 years in marketing, I think what I do is I get down in the weeds, replying to emails, and oh God's customers just come in, and oh my goodness, we've run out of Diet Coke, and then it would come to about 7 o'clock in the evening. I really should do some marketing. Oh, sorry, I can't do that tomorrow. And so we need to be really conscious of this, because the importance of marketing in terms of occasionally having disproportionate effect on the success and survival of businesses can't really be overstated.
Yeah.
Modern business theory tends to think business is all about operational efficiency, and I think that's an unfortunate byproduct of the shareholder value movement. And I can do a whole separate podcast on how catastrophic it's been, which is that the general mentality of most boards of directors of companies think they compete on the grounds of operational efficiency. In other words, they think that competition is something that happens in the factory, when in reality, 95% of competition actually gets decided on the shelf in the sale room.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the extraordinary thing, I don't know if you've ever attended a board meeting of a reasonably large company.
I have. Well, I used to present market research findings to many multinationals back
and if you sat in, you probably had to. The extraordinarily small proportion of every board meeting, which is actually given to things like growth, opportunity, revenue, versus costs, overheads. Okay, the extent to which the conversation in a board meeting is almost about everything except the customer is completely bizarre. I mean, in my view.
Well, I do know where you're coming from there, Rory. I mean, being customer experience is one of my specialisms.
By the way, that I think is the CX, UX, all those disciplines which have funny little acronyms. I would argue there's a very good case that in many cases your people doing that should, if they're good, be the best paid people in the business, because they're the people who can make a transformative difference.
No, absolutely.
And I'll be honest here, we both missed that golden age of advertising. But there are an awful lot of extraordinary businesses and brands that have been created really through very, very good CX and UX or breakthrough discoveries. I mean, you know me with the Uber map,
Yeah.
I won't repeat it, but that was weirdly, that transformed the emotional experience of waiting for a taxi. The other example I give is the London Overground, which basically took some vastly moribund and underused rail tracks and got them used to the same extent as the Elizabeth line, which cost £20 billion, by basically the marketing ploy of pretending railway lines were tube lines and adding them to the tube map.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, and when I say, look, you created $20 billion worth or £20 billion worth of infrastructure, not with engineering and tunnelling and rails and track and trains. Okay, they spent 100 million improving it. I'm not disputing that. I'm not saying the engineers played no role, but the greater part of that value was created with ink and pixels.
Yeah.
Because suddenly Londoners could see how the Overground fitted in with the rest of their journey. It was now an integral part of their journey planning, whereas previously it was an alternative to journey planning. Unless you were a total rail nut who hated the tube, which is actually kind of me, actually. Okay. You never. I use Silverlink Metro. Do you remember that? That's what it used to be called.
I do.
So
yes,
there was a whole rail network around London that was called Silverlink Metro, and literally people who lived 300 yards from a Silverlink Metro station didn't know it was there or didn't know where the trains went. And I mean, I know that from anecdotal stuff. There was somebody who could have improved their journey to work every single day for 10 years if they'd known that they could go from Clapham High Street to Canada Water, but they didn't know.
Yeah. Yeah. B2B Frameworks is a curated collection of proven business frameworks to develop your strategic thinking skills, solve your biggest business problems, unlock your next promotion. Our mission is to help you achieve these goals. We want to create the next generation of successful business leaders by providing the tools and frameworks needed to create effective strategies that drive business growth. Each framework comes with a downloadable set of instructions with large, colourful diagrams and editable templates to guide you through the process step by step and prompt you to consider the problem from every possible angle. Along with audio guides and educational tools, our extensive content library is full of real-world examples and case studies of strategic thinking in action. So why learn with B2B Frameworks? We've carefully curated only the most effective, proven business and marketing frameworks. Our downloadable materials and audio guides will help you easily apply each framework. And the insights and advice you'll find across the site are based on 30 years of consulting experience from one of the world's leading business strategy experts, Paul Haig. B2B Frameworks is a small investment to advance your career or grow your business. Start your journey to becoming a successful business leader by joining B2B Frameworks today. No, and to your point, it's at marketing, it's putting it at the center of every organization, making sure you're focused on the customer. In fact, I think if I think back, I set up my agency in '98, and I remember I spent a whole week typing up into Excel the research buyer's guide it was over 1,000 research buyers in there to target them. And then, we just sent out direct mail and we were religious with that. Every month we'd send, emails as well as direct mail, and we did other marketing ploys. But I think one point was that really hit home to me was when myself and one of my American colleagues, we walked into a meeting with the marketing director of MasterCard in Purchase, New York. And he held up his hands. He said,
"Isn't that brilliant, by the way, that MasterCard is based in the town of Purchase?"
Yeah, no, it is.
I mean, who could have made that up? Yeah.
But we walked into the meeting and he said, you've got me. You've got my attention. We hadn't done work with them before. And he held an array of different direct mail that we targeted with him over the years. And he said, it worked, and it worked then, it works now as well.
By the way, direct mail is still, in the words of one client of mine who's responsible for sort of digital business, she described direct mail as annoyingly effective. And it's a very interesting thing because there's a kind of deep-seated belief that your job now in digital, if you're a digital business, is to dematerialize and automate everything, because the principal function of marketers has unfortunately shifted from efficiency to effectiveness. Sorry, from effectiveness to efficiency, okay? And the assumption is that something that's more efficient is also more effective. Now, that is sort of true in some engineering problems. An electric motor that's more efficient is almost certainly a better electric motor. Unfortunately, an ad that is more efficient may be less effective. In other words, it may reach the same number of people in the same quantity with the same frequency at a lower cost and say exactly the same thing, but it's a worse ad.
Yeah.
Partly because it's just less expensive. And one of the things I would argue, by the way, is that there's a kind of law of commensurability, which is the extent to which I am spending money with you, okay, needs to be matched in some way with the effort you put into selling me, the effort, expense, and so forth you put into actually selling me. It's simply that if I'm buying a car, okay, I kind of want a brochure. And if I'm signing up to the American Express card, I kind of want a bit of paper and card, okay? Do you see what I mean? Because I'm making a relatively big commitment. It's a relatively big decision. And consequently, it's rather like in an expensive hotel. This is not always the case. Part of the reason, it's not that I want people to make a fuss of me. It's just that I need a degree of fuss made that's commensurate with the amount I'm spending. And I think there's some sort of mental symmetry in there in the human brain where, as I always say, nobody invites anybody to their wedding by email. They send out a card.
Yeah.
And it's just, and in some ways, sort of the expense of direct mail may be just a kind of significance marker. Yeah, we acknowledge this is a big decision, which is why we're, putting a little bit of extra effort into communicating it to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Well, I think,
also,
in fact, yeah.
And my kids, by the way, get really excited by direct mail because they've never lived in an era where there was too much of it.
Well, in fact, in the post just last week, I've still got it in my tray here, but it came through in a blue envelope. It was so it stood out from the rest of the bills, but it was something to do with social media profit revolution. Some conference in London, and I don't get any direct mail anymore, so I just happen to keep that. But it shows it works.
That business, by the way, that you have to actively throw it away. That in other words, that it might sit around in your toast rack, and also because it's scarce. In other words, when we see digital ads, we kind of expect to see them again. Okay,
Yeah.
right. When we get emails about a sale, we expect to get another one. But because direct mail is expensive and this is the only one, it kind of answers the question. I always think when you're selling something, you've got to answer. A lot of marketers focus on the why you should buy this. But I think there's a second question which people are asking, particularly now in an age where we have vastly more discretionary expenditure than we did. It's not just about why, it's about why now. And I think ads that say why now is a great time to. And I think direct mail, because it's a kind of, okay, because you kind of don't expect to receive 6 more, it still has a kind of scarcity value to it.
Yes.
Yeah. I think it does put you in the, well, if I'm going to do this at all, I'd better do it now.
Yeah.
I'd love to explore this more because logically, well, no, actually, that's not true. I suppose an email is only as effective as a handwritten letter if you have an unbelievably simplistic idea about the human processing of information. That, in other words, it purely looks at the text on the page and makes no reference to other contextual things like the quality of the paper or the effort that's been put into writing it. And I think humans automatically, effectively, are huge. I mean, there's a lot of big research which Kantar has done with, I think, Wavemaker and the Side Business School, which shows that all media are not equal. The idea of it just being about eyeballs is a nonsense because the significant, what we infer from seeing an ad on a poster versus seeing it on a banner versus seeing it in the press thing is very, very different. And there are some jobs that only some media can do. Or that some media where some media have a huge comparative advantage. Now, this is what worries me, okay? If you're a bit of a Byron Sharpie kind of guy, which I kind of am, one of the lessons of Byron Sharp is that if you're a big, successful, established brand, you should try and sell to as many people as you possibly can profitably sell to, right? Yeah. Because large numbers of fairly infrequent buyers who aren't necessarily loyal, but for whom you form part of their repertoire, constitute quite a large part of your profits. Okay, and the old way we used to do marketing was who is our target audience? In other words, who can afford to buy this and is, and is reasonably likely to benefit from the purchase. Okay, that's the definition of your target audience. And then we would set out to reach and convert those people, obviously by low-cost means if possible. So American Express loved these things called take ones. Well, you'll remember this from the 1980s and 90s. You went into a curry house and there was a list of Amex application forms on the counter, okay? And, you go to a blingy 5-star hotel and there'd be a list of American Express Gold Card application forms on the counter. You couldn't apply for the Platinum card back then. That was invitation only, okay? But they obviously liked those. But they also recognised that you could basically have take ones in every single goddamn shop in the world, and you'd only capture about 5 to 10% of your, maybe 15, 20% of your potential target audience. So they did direct mail, which was more expensive than take ones, but it brought in profitably people who take ones wouldn't have brought in, right? Yeah. Okay. I'm using this as a very simple analogy, by the way. Now, what's happened in digital is instead of saying, who are our target audience and what media do we need to reach them? And will some people only respond to this? And will some people need this? And are there people who, until they've seen a press ad for this, won't take it seriously? Instead of asking those bigger questions, okay, they just go, we will define our target audience. They're not doing this intentionally, but this is what they're doing by optimizing for efficiency, not for effectiveness. They're defining their target audience as those people who are happy to interact with us in low-cost channels. Yeah. And that's a bit like American Express going, well, because tape ones are cheaper than direct mail, we're going to define our target audience as those people who'll wander into a shop or hotel and spontaneously pick up a bit of paper and fill it in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, if American Express had done that, American Express would no longer exist. Okay, it might have been a very, very efficient company for a few short years with very, very low acquisition costs. But you're optimizing there for arse covering in the marketing department. You're not optimizing for the effectiveness of the overall business.
You talk about effectiveness, actually, and there's your book on the shelves there, Alchemy, and the long and the short of it. Les Burnett was my last guest on the podcast, and in fact, I posed a question to him to say, what would you like to ask Rory? And he said, I've asked Rory once before, but I'd like you.
He never got a straight answer, probably. What is the question? Yeah.
So he said, I'd like to pose it to him that, and he said that he's asked you this. So yeah, let's see if you can remember the answer. But although behavioural economics is very interesting, he said, he feels it's a bit anecdotal, telling you about the quirks of human behaviours. And is there an underlying theory or general principles that explains these biases and patterns in behaviour about people are so rational?
Okay. First of all, I'm going to defend and try and rehabilitate the word anecdotal, because interesting, significant and often counterintuitive information emerges first not in data but in anecdotal form. Okay, and it's vitally important to keep alert to what's surprising, because that's where a really valuable differentiating insight comes from. Generally, insights come from the edges, not from the aggregates. Okay, so big data can actually be incredibly dangerous because you think your typical customer is basically an amalgam of all your customers.
Yeah.
Okay, and also all big data comes from the past as well. So it's worth noting that with big data, you are disproportionately looking in the rearview mirror and optimizing on the past rather than optimizing on what may be a very different future.
Yeah.
So I would argue, okay, there are a few reasons why behavioural science is really important. One of which is it's really important to spend a lot of time thinking and talking about this stuff. Why do people do this stuff? Because it is, I admit, a somewhat nebulous and sometimes fantastical conversation. But it's a period that needs to be had. And the analogy I use there is detective work, okay? There are two phases to detective work. There's the exploratory investigative phase, followed by the evidential phase, finding out who did it and then proving they did it, right? And it is wrong to demand that all information used in the investigative phase must be evidential. By the way, I thought they went wrong with COVID on that. People started referring to something called the science. There is no such fucking thing as the science, because science, particularly when dealing with a novel virus, is a process of inquiry. It's not a process of saying we will make decisions based on only those things for which we have evidence, because you didn't have enough evidence, right? Okay. And so what you should have been doing, I remember doing a little bit of investigative work myself. So we started out in COVID swabbing down our parcels, and my friend who was a nephrologist, a doctor, would leave any packages in their garage for 3 days before opening them. And then after a few weeks of this, I said, have we noticed that lots of postmen have been getting ill? No. Okay, so that probably isn't a problem, right? Okay. Because, postmen or people in postal sorting offices, had the thing been spread by fomites, would have been expected to get disproportionately ill, and they didn't. Okay? And that's what I call investigative. Okay? It's not saying we have evidence. It's we should keep an eye on this to see what happens. And so a lot of cops would start, if you had a murder, the first question they do, they go around the neighbours, and they would say, did you notice anything unusual on the night of the 17th of March? Now, that's a completely open-ended question, right? And the answer might be a funny man drove past in a van it's always a white van, isn't it? A funny man drove past in a white van 4 times. Now, that has no evidential value. You can't bang someone up for life for driving in a funny way, but it tells you where to look next. And the vital thing there is that you go, well, okay, well, let's look at some CCTV, see if we can pick up this van. And if you then discover that the guy who's, driving the van is a well-known pervert or weirdo, well, you'd upweight the investigation still further, wouldn't you? Because although you've proved nothing, in Bayesian terms, you need to reweight your probabilities, right? Okay. Now, I think what's happening is we're creating a cult of business decision making, which is now I partly value behavioural science because it sows doubt and uncertainty. It makes people go, well, this might be the right answer, but maybe we should consider the opposite, or both. Maybe the solution to the consumer is actually 2 extremes, not an average. The other reason is that for whatever reason, marketing is fucking doomed if it doesn't get out of its ghetto. Now, the real problem for ad agencies isn't that the marketing director doesn't like them, it's that the board doesn't respect the marketing director, if I'm being really blunt about this. And in a lot of organizations, the marketing guy isn't on the board. He's treated, to be honest, as a supplier, okay? Because ad agencies all started in the days even when you and I started in marketing, about 70% of ad spend was packaged goods. It was Unilever, P&G, Diageo, Reckitt Benckiser. It was stuff you bought off a shelf in a shop. That was 70% of ad spend. And in those organizations, the CEO has done a stint in marketing. Marketing is represented at board level. It's a very, very big cost, so it's taken very seriously indeed. That 70% is now down to about 20%. And ad agencies are now working with marketing directors who aren't on the board, who are basically desperately having to justify their own existence because they're seen as a cost, not as a source of revenue and growth, mistakenly, in my opinion, okay? And one of the things we can do, and one of the things some of our clients have done really effectively, is use behavioral science and behavioral economics in particular to talk marketing to the board. Because you can't go to a board and talk about brand iconography. You can't go to a board and talk about, in fact, if they hear the word brand, they go, ooh, too fluffy for me, switch off, not my problem, leave that to the marketing people. It's all fluffy and weird and I don't really like it. Whereas if you can go and say, we have a theory that people behave this way because of this and we'd like to test it, you can have a really good board level conversation. And I think our job should be to find a way of discussing marketing with a reasonable degree of peer-reviewed literature, which is respected and which earns the odd Nobel Prize, but also with a vocabulary and also, let's face it, an objective behavioural change, okay, which is much more likely to secure the attention of people who hold the purse strings than something weird about like unprompted awareness, which is a proxy measure.
Yeah.
And so I could go on to this. The fact that we haven't come up with a theory of everything. Okay, the fact that there's a replication crisis, that's not a bug, that's a feature. Because the fact that these things don't replicate is exactly why a business can't comfortably make assumptions about their customer psychology based on simply copying a finding from somewhere else, because context has such a huge effect on how people think, decide, and act, that the same person faced with the same choice in a different context will make a completely different decision.
Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of that is fundamental to the nuggets, the gold nuggets that are in your book, Alchemy, and in fact,
see it on the shelf.
On the shelf, and I love the section where you talk about the opposite of a good idea can be a good idea. Let
me explain a great example of this. So I meet at a meeting someone who's like the UK's walking czar. And because they're there to promote walking in the populace, they campaign for footpaths and rights of way and, better pavements and all that sort of stuff. And I said, that's good. I said, but you're missing the opposite. And they said, what's the opposite? I said, You also need to campaign for more seating, more benches. Because people on the margin, elderly people, the reason they don't walk isn't because they have a shortage of horizontal surfaces. It's because once they're 300, 400 yards from home and they get a bout of sciatica or they get a bit tired, they've got nowhere to sit down. Now, if you go to a seaside, right, where there are benches because of memorial benches, there are too many benches at the British seaside. I mean, literally, It's insane, okay? But one beneficial upside of this, now, a lot of the reason they're walking is because it's by the sea and it's nice walking by the sea. But anybody knows if they walk along the seafront that if they get a bit puffed out, they can have a sit down. Anybody, I mean, I had this when I had a bout of sciatica. It was a bit of a wonderful sort of revelation because it's a bit like a premonition of what it's like to be 20 years older. And I suddenly realized you leave Charing Cross, you go, oh, Charing Cross to Soho, it's easy, I'll walk it. And then if your sciatica kicked in halfway there, literally you were forced to buy a cup of coffee in order to find somewhere to sit down. There's nowhere. And okay, that's partly, because vagrants sleep on benches, and if you put benches there, you'll get tramps. But come on, I mean, I think we need to think about every, I don't think you should make old people incapable of walking through London just as a sort of a rather unkind means of tramp avoidance. And I said, half of your job is actually to make it easier for people to stop walking. So quite often, I think, the solution to something isn't the middle, which is a compromise and a trade-off. It's actually to offer people both extremes. I often say the perfect hotel check-in is either they make a massive fuss of you and they take you up to your room and they, as happened once, I think in the Mandarin Oriental in Hong Kong, they actually don't check in at the check-in desk. They take you up to your room and they sit you down at a massive desk and they give you the paperwork and they make you a cup of tea while you're actually signing into the hotel. That's a great way to check into a hotel. I remember that years later. But another great way is you just check in on your mobile phone and go straight up to the room. And people who are really frequent guests in a hotel would probably prefer the latter, even though it's cheaper to provide.
Yeah.
The best thing, I often quote this, the best thing I ever learned from a futurologist is that there aren't trends, there are vectors. That generally there's usually a counter trend. And so consequently, this is one of the reasons why strategy is so interesting, because quite often a very rational strategy will put you right in the middle with all your competitors. And the direction of travel is centrifugal. Dyson, classic example. Okay, a logical person developing a vacuum cleaner would say, well, let's look at the vacuum cleaner market. You've got Miele at the top. You've got things like the Henry and some cheap models at the bottom. You've got the sweet spots round about the £100 mark for vacuum cleaners. And then Dyson does something completely bonkers based on the assumption, which, to be honest, I would have assumed was totally insane, and under most circumstances that people will pay 600 quid for a vacuum cleaner, but it turns out they will in huge numbers.
Yeah. I mean, behavioural economics, I've been interested in it. I've been in the research world, but I've been interested ever since Daniel Kahneman.
I don't know why Les is such a skeptic, because actually it can partly explain the long and the short of it as well.
Well,
which is the long and the short of it patently depends on some model, which, I'm not yet confident. But the distinction between what you might call the why and the why now, for example. The short of it, the long of it might be answering the question why you should buy this thing, and you've heard of it, and lots of people have it, and we do a lot of advertising, so it must be quite a big popular thing, so you can feel reasonably confident in buying it. And the short of it might be I'm happy to buy that thing, but why now? Oh, look, it's 20% off. Okay.
Yeah.
Or I get a free hat, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a totally crude model, and Les, I'm totally free for Les, who's a far greater person than I am, to say, Rory, that's full of shit. But I mean, that is at least something with explanatory power, even though I've sort of invented it. It may or may not be true, and we can test that.
Yeah. Well, I think a roundtable discussion is therefore one where we should take this.
Lots of people, I think, applied for the American Express Gold Card because the American Express Gold Card was an extremely desired thing, still is, I would argue. Okay, and they desired one, but they were never going to get around to applying. And then they got a letter and thought, well, this is my chance. They actually want me to apply for the Gold Card. This is my chance. I might not get this chance again, so I better apply for the Gold Card now.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. I'll chat with Les about this because I'd like to discuss it a bit more.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, just sticking on that topic though, and particular to behavioral economics, Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, got me interested in it back in, 15 years ago nearly now. And, I was always never aware of a course that I could, particularly sign up to learn about this subject until now, Rory, because you founded your MAD Masters course in 21.
Yes.
Do you want to give us some background? Is this course solely
the course
online?
is the way I always describe it is, look, I'm not telling you how to do your job. Okay, 90% of the time, do your job to your best of your ability. Do the logical thing. I'm absolutely. There's a wonderful phrase, I think it's by A.N. Whitehead, who said sort of bursts of thought or rationality are not to be deployed all the time. They're to be deployed rather like cavalry charges in battle. Judicious, decisive moments. And I'd say the same about behavioral science, and I'd say the same about what you might call creativity as well, by the way. Okay. Yeah. I mean, if I tried to be creative about absolutely everything all the time, I'd go insane. You can't rethink everything. Some things have got to be driven by habit, heuristics, best practice, etc. But, and this is, I suppose, the way I end my book, and very much the way I end the course as well, we have to make space for this. What if the opposite were true? What if actually all this effort we've done to reduce the price of our product is having no effect on sales, and the best way to have an effect on sales is something psychological rather than something technological, or something to do with the price or formulation or functionality of the product. And in many cases, by the way, I write in the book in Alchemy about the fact that it was the brilliant guy, I think Akio Morita, who vetoed the addition of a record function to the Sony Walkman.
Right.
And if you think about it, sort of Steve Jobs copied that with the iPod. It would have been incredibly easy to add a microphone to the iPod, but he didn't. Right?
Yeah.
And that's because sometimes we can do something totally logical, which is adding functionality to a product, but weirdly, it actually reduces the appeal of the product. Now, that is completely counterintuitive to an economist who'd say higher utility, higher value.
Yeah.
But now, deciding whether you want the product and making a decision as to what the product is for, is now more difficult. Because instead of answering one question, do I want to be able to do this thing? I've now got to answer, what about the other thing? That might be, well, I don't know, am I paying for something I don't really use? You know what I mean? Yeah. And, is this a dictaphone? Would have been the question with the Sony Walkman, So there's a really interesting point, which is that every now and then you've got to literally go, okay, let's keep aware of the wider context in which we're operating. And are we, for example, optimizing something through a narrow focus on a single component, which is our job description? And that actually we're assuming that by optimizing the part, the whole becomes more optimal.
Yeah.
And that isn't true. So this is also a gateway drug to complexity theory, right? Which is that there's a great phrase from W. Edwards Deming, I think his name is, which is, to optimize the whole, you have to sub-optimize the parts. And that what most businesses do is they optimize all the component parts of everything. But at the level of the whole, this may be counterproductive. It may be not just wasted effort, it may be actually counterproductive. It may be destructive effort.
Yeah. Rory, I could speak for hours with you, and we've not covered half the questions, but that's fine because we've covered so much more. To conclude, I'm just going to ask you some quick fire questions, and just one from the listeners today from Christian Malholm in Copenhagen. He asks, what's widely accepted marketing principle that you believe is actually wrong, or at least massively overrated?
That's a great question. I think there's some marketing principles which are very poorly understood outside marketing, which we need to trumpet. That's the opposite to his question. So it's what thing are marketers right about, which other people are wrong about. One of which is cannibalization by selling through different channels, by the way. I think that purchase is very context sensitive, and generally, when you add a new sales channel, a large part of the sales from that new channel are incremental. Okay. People are wrong sometimes about the primacy of brand preference. Okay. So it doesn't make sense. It makes enormous sense in many choice settings to emphasize brand preference. A lot of decisions in supermarkets are made at the level of the shelf, and therefore you are choosing then between different brands, and prices and so forth. Will you pay a premium for a brand?
Yeah.
There are also cases where, and the reason that always happens is because most budgets are brand commerce budgets. Okay. But I was just having a conversation with someone today from the cinema industry, and I said, actually, the cinema industry is, I want to go to the cinema first. What's on? Okay, that's on at these two cinemas. Which of the two do I prefer? Now, there's a brand component. There's obviously a geographical component. I'm not driving to Edinburgh to see a film. My dad famously did drive to Cambridge from London to go and see the Wild Bunch, was it? When that was not shown in London but was shown in Cambridge. The Wild One, I think it was. But okay, mostly okay. There's going to be a mix. There's going to be geography is going to play a part. Past experience is going to play a part. The brand is going to play a part. Okay, undoubtedly, price is going to play a part. But the way to grow the cinema chain is not really to strengthen your brand versus other people's brands. That will have an effect, but a far better use of your money would be to encourage more people to think about going to the cinema. Okay. Yeah. Right, and the best use of your money would be to pool your money with other cinema operators and do a category campaign that says electric cars would be another case in point. Okay, most of the budget sits with the brand, and the brands all talk about how much range they have, which means that the net effect of the electric car market is all talking about range, which is about the only negative of owning an electric car.
Yeah.
Okay, there is a case where somebody needs to pool a load of money from electric car manufacturers. I don't know how you do this because it would be an administrative or organizational nightmare, and do an ad campaign that just says, here are 15 reasons why electric cars are better than petrol cars. Because they are, right? And by talking about, our range is slightly better than Audi's range, what you're actually doing is you're taking the whole market and focusing it on what is arguably the only negative, I would say, actually. Okay. Yeah. I mean, range and time taken to charge and possibly infrastructure availability in the UK is less and less of an issue. In the US, where you have huge distances, range anxiety is still a relevant thing. But nobody's talking about the fact that, okay, so a lot of people said electric cars are expensive. And I said, well, compared to what? And I said, I admit, an electric Skoda is more expensive than a petrol Skoda. But in terms of the driving experience and performance, an electric Skoda is closer to a petrol Audi than it is to, and quietness and comfort and, a load of other things, is closer to a petrol Audi than it is to a petrol Skoda. So is it then expensive if you consider the fact that the driving dynamics and goodness knows what else, and indeed the cost of running it in many cases, okay, is so much lower? Maybe not. Okay. And so, we're actually comparing the wrong thing. And so that's one of the reasons I think, one of the things I think marketers get wrong is they always go, and Dave Trott says this as well, by the way, they always go, okay, the answer's brand, now what's the question? Okay, that entirely depends on where brand sits in the decision-making hierarchy, okay? And in some cases, it's absolutely primary. I completely agree. But in many cases, it doesn't matter how great individual cinema brands are relative to other people. If I never get around to thinking I ought to go to the cinema, which I really like when I do it, by the way, I just don't do it nearly enough. I never go to the fucking theatre, right? What theatres need to do is not worry about the relative status of different theatre brands in the UK. They just need more people going, I feel like going to the theatre. Now what's on?
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah. No, that's good. Would
be, by the way, that's a branch of behavioural science, which is really called decision science. And decision science is really one of the, and there are a lot of adjacencies to behavioral science. There's complexity theory, there's evolutionary psychology, okay, and to be honest, if I start an Ogilvy evolutionary psychology department, it'll be a lot harder to get revenue than if you call it a behavioral economics or behavioral science department. But there are a lot of there are a lot of adjacencies, and decision science is emphatically one of them. Where do you sit on the decision making tree? And one of the really important things about that is if you look at AI, the big way, and this is the big problem, okay, if you want to disrupt a category, you don't sell the same thing in the same place to the same people, right, as the existing established kind of dominant players. Yeah. What you do is you find a different context, a different way to sell. And then you dominate a new. So the Argos catalogue, okay? EasyJet putting 0800 on the signs of planes. So people don't go to a travel agent anymore to book a flight. They phone up EasyJet, right? Okay. People don't necessarily go to a shop to decide what toaster to buy because they've already decided what toaster to buy while sitting on the toilet. Okay. You've changed the context in which the decision takes place. And once you do that, the usual brand hierarchies can sometimes disappear.
Yeah. Yeah. Rory, you've been a fabulous guest today.
It's been a joy.
Who would you like me to reach out to, invite to come on the podcast in the future? Who would you like to hear?
Dave Trott.
Perfect. I haven't had Dave on, so I will reach out to him.
Yeah, only because he's a brilliant writer, and he doesn't do many podcasts. And I would, I'd love to see him. I'd love to see a bit of Dave Trott live.
Might need you to persuade him on that one then. But
just copy me in.
And finally, my next guest is Greg Hahn, CCO and co-founder of Mischief USA. What question would you like me to pose?
Oh, they're brilliant agency. Okay, that's fantastic.
What question would you pose to Greg?
Is he a creative guy? Is he?
Yes. Yeah, Chief Creative Officer.
Of course he is. Yes, I know him. Yeah. Let me have a think. Do you find that behavioural science is a very useful part of legitimizing mischief without it merely seeming like willful perversity?
Fabulous question. Rory, thanks again for this. I mean, I think concluding my main takeaways today are that, we as humans need to be curious. We need to ask the right questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Don't always slavishly follow the data.
No.
It's about being creative, zigging when others are zagging. And at the end of the day, how we rethink marketing to deliver value that truly resonates with customers. Behavioural economics is certainly a tool in the marketer's toolbox.
If marketing doesn't get back into the boardroom, it's not just that marketing is badly screwed, business is badly screwed. Because the focus on the shareholder as the primary function, in other words, the primary focus of attention of the business is catastrophic in about 5 different ways. Okay, it makes businesses less adaptive, it makes them less inventive, it makes them less responsive to changing conditions, okay, and less agile. It also makes working for the business fundamentally depressing because the people who manage the business have a focus and motivation which is entirely misaligned with most of the people who are in the business to do what the business actually does, which is to serve customers, okay? And one of the reasons why working in business is so depressing nowadays is because most people are pretty happy looking after clients because it's a natural human instinct to actually be useful to people whom you meet or who pay you money, okay? Right, that doesn't require any. Providing good customer service is something which I think humans derive great pleasure from doing. No one gets out of bed to kind of enrich the state of Wisconsin DMV pension fund, right? Okay, and so it creates this complete disconnect. Okay, where you don't have volunteers anymore. You don't have a volunteer army in a company anymore. You have mercenaries who are basically rewarded hugely on shareholder metrics. Okay. And those people then, because they don't trust the other people in the organization, because the other people are not motivated by shareholder value creation, then impose a command and control model on the organization, which completely demoralizes everybody else because they feel that the people at the top aren't interested in what they're really doing. Okay. And so you have, instead of a business of a volunteer army, you have a mixture of mercenaries and you have conscripts.
Yeah.
And it's had terrible effects, I think, on corporate cohesion, to a point where you talk to people who are like cardiac surgeons who basically say, I got out of this business because I'm a cardiac surgeon and I'm sick of being bossed around by the finance department or administrators or whatever.
Yeah. We need to win back our respect and take the reins again in
Absolutely
the
right.
world. So, Rory, you're everywhere, so people won't have a problem finding you if they're interested in getting in touch. The Mad Masters course.
That's .co.uk, I think.
Okay. And
you can Google it anyway. Obviously, I have a new book coming out, but there's the old book if you haven't read it. That's probably the best kind of summation of everything. And YouTube. There's a lot of me on YouTube. Or if you can't be bothered, there's TikTok because it's mercifully brief.
Well, thanks again, Rory. And yes, I'm sure your head will be popping up on TikTok for many others for the coming year. But thank you.
Who knows? Thanks ever so much. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
This podcast has been brought to you in partnership with Awards International. Awards International is dedicated to running successful business awards programs and conferences. Founded in 2008 by Don Hales and Neil Skihel, the company's core mission centres on honouring and celebrating exceptional achievements in customer and employee experience, but also in overall business excellence across diverse sectors. In addition, their aim is to showcase best practices, innovations, and achievements that contribute positively to these areas, ultimately inspiring other organisations to improve their own customer experience, employee engagement strategies, and overall business success. To find out more about Awards International and how to register your interest in their awards programs, check their website www.awardsinternational.com.